All right, I think we'll get started. Um, this is a seminar about the multiple mini interview. It's a different kind of format interview, different from the traditional interview. This seminar is part of our PAP 1003 application planning seminar series. I want to make an announcement first that if you registered for the CCP seminar as well as this seminar and you're planning to watch both at the same time, please do not, because then you'll end up getting credit for neither one, okay? If you signed up for this seminar and you're going to medical school and you're applying this cycle, I would stay here and get the recording for the CCP seminar, but do not try to attend both seminars at the same time. Okay, so I just want to make that clear that we will know if you're in both seminars at the same time and you'll get credit for neither. So we prefer if you, as I said, are planning to apply to medical school this cycle with either a letter packet or a committee letter or a committee packet, it's probably more beneficial for you to stay here and to just get the recording from the CCP seminar session today. Okay. One more announcement, as with all of our seminars, there is a reflection statement that you will need to fill out for to acknowledge that you were here and present and got something out of the seminar. And so if you don't have the link for that, let me just see, if you don't have the link for that reflection statement, I can share it at the end of the seminar. Okay. Let's get started. I also had the pleasure of being joined by Francesca Jerez. She was with us yesterday as well. Actually, Francesca, maybe I'll make you a co-host here. And Francesca is a successful applicant to medical school in the current cycle. She has been through a number of different interviews during this past cycle, including interviews that followed the MMI format. So she is going to be here to share her advice on how to prepare and her suggestions for how to do well with this type of interview. So thank you, Francesca, and I will begin. Okay. So what is the multiple mini interview? For those of you who are not aware, this is an interview format that uses a series of short, independent assessments in a timed circuit to obtain an aggregate score of a candidate's what we call soft skills. This format, this MMI format, was developed to address two problems that admissions committees saw with what was just the traditional interview format. And that was that the traditional interview format did not always accurately predict a student's performance in medical school. And some of the most frequent issues of concern were those of non-cognitive skills, such as interpersonal skills. This format was initially developed by McMaster University Medical School, which is located in Canada, in 2004. And since that time, it's been adopted by medical, dental, pharmacy, and veterinary programs around the world. So it's very popular. It is used by 46 MD programs in this country, as well as 7 DO programs. So when you get your invitation to interview, you will also be told the format for the interview. The MMI is designed to assess your communication skills and competencies that cannot always be measured by your standardized exam or by your transcript. They want to know more about how you demonstrate your critical thinking, your problem solving, your ethical decision making, and your ability to assess various viewpoints while showing empathy and also displaying teamwork. Okay, there's a lot being assessed here. On Zoom, and typically all the MMIs now are virtual. They used to be in person pre-pandemic, where you would show up at a medical school and there would be a line of rooms and you would go through an actual, you would read the scenario on the outside door of the room, and then you would enter and you would have to respond to that scenario. Now, this all takes place in a virtual format, okay? Sometimes that can be, more helpful if you're more comfortable with that. It's a different kind of way of assessing the student, but essentially what they tried to do with the virtual format is to simulate the same experience that you would have in person. So it is between 6 and 10 scenarios. You do get a little break at some point, but you're fairly busy for most of the time. The scenario is going to appear on the screen, and you're going to have 2 minutes or less to read the scenario and plan out your response without the use of notes. Now, there are some programs that may allow you to use notes, but I would not assume that you can use notes unless they specifically instruct that you can do that. The interviewer will then appear on the screen. The screen will go blank. When the time runs out, the interviewer is going to appear on the screen and then ask you how you would respond to the scenario. There is a digital timer at the bottom of the screen, and you have 6 minutes approximately to introduce yourself, restate the scenario that you just read and confirm your understanding of it, and then deliver your response. After that time runs out, screen's going to go blank, and then you're going to receive a new screen with a new scenario. And Francesca, I would love for you to just kind of reflect on your experience with this. Is this how it worked for you? Did you ever have any sort of technical difficulties, or were there any variations to this scenario?
There
I
were
mean, setup.
just variations. There's not always a digital timer, especially if it's on Zoom. The ones that were on Zoom didn't have a digital timer, but the ones that use the platform did have a digital timer. And yeah, I would assume no notes, because some will even specify you're really not allowed to take notes. Some don't care, but some will really specify you're not allowed to take notes. And also you don't really have time. Those 2 minutes go very fast. And then if it's on Zoom, what usually happens is you'll join the Zoom. The person you're interviewing with will copy and paste the scenario, and they'll say, can you read the scenario? Can you see it or whatnot? And then you say yes, and then they start a timer themselves and time you, and you have that time to read the scenario. And then it's 6 to 8 minutes. I would practice for 6 minutes to be on the safe side. And they usually also, before they let you begin your response, almost always they will say, did you get a chance to read the response, and or are you ready to begin? And you could use that time to say, I just need a few more seconds to gather my thoughts, if you need it. So that is an option. All of them ask that. And with the break, how that usually worked in my experiences was, if it was on a platform, you would not know when the break comes. It would go to the next thing and it would say, okay, this is actually your break session. Or if it was in Zoom, there's usually someone from the admissions office serving as a moderator. So they're putting people into breakout rooms, and they say, like, okay, Francesca, Nicole, and Nina, you are sitting this one out, and you just sit there in
I
the
see.
Zoom. So that's usually how the break works, but the break is just the amount of time that a full block would take,
So
basically.
the
Either
scenario
way.
is either presented and then the individual who's assessing you appears, or the person who is assessing you then shares the screen with the scenario. Is that correct?
Correct. And you asked about technical difficulties. In one of them, I had technical difficulties with the platform. I couldn't hear with a certain platform that they use. I couldn't hear the person that was interviewing me, and that whole thing was gone. It wasn't anything on my end. It was just happening actually to a lot of people with the platform. But the admissions office are very flexible with you, because some will either, and in this particular one, I was able to redo it because they want every single one of this, you to have every single one of the scenarios. I believe there were 8, but in a different school, I know that if you have technical difficulties for one, they just will cancel that one for
Oh,
you. Because I think they said I think they give 9 or 10, and they say you only need, they've done studies where you only need 6 to understand the character of the person. So that's also something that does happen.
great. Okay, that's very helpful. So the qualities that the MMI is assessing, um, yeah, I mean, they're all kind of laid out here. Are you someone who's a self-directed learner? Do you have the ability to self-assess situations? Do you have a strong work ethic? Are you able to communicate effectively, able to think ethically, able to manage your time, able to work in a team, able to tolerate stress? Do you have good judgment? Do you exhibit compassion and empathy? And do you exhibit respect for evidence-based medicine? And there are different kinds of questions within the MMI. Some are hypothetical scenarios, right? They can be clinical, non-clinical. You have to make a decision, explain your reasoning. Some stations may be asking you to act out a situation. Again, it can be clinical or non-clinical. They want to see how you display your communication and conflict resolution skills. Some stations are more open-ended questions, and they want to see if you can create something new or improvise a solution. Are you someone who's creative and adaptable? There are scenarios that focus on healthcare policy, and again, it could be real or hypothetical, but you want to be able to discuss the potential implications, benefits, and drawbacks of that policy. And then there are scenarios that focus on past experience, past conflicts or difficult feedback or failures or stressful situations, and how you responded to the situation. Did you want to add anything to this slide, Francesca?
I think that, yeah, just within an MMI, prepared to get any one of these, because I think it can be really difficult to go from talking about healthcare policy to then acting out a situation. So I think when I was practicing, I didn't give this slide enough weight, that you do have such a variability in the questions that they ask you, because they can also, it's explicitly in another slide, but they do ask traditional interview questions as well. So I think the Savvy Pre-Med MMI generator is very, very good for that, because I've
Yep,
gotten, yeah, like scenarios directly from that. So
yep, yep. Okay, so some common MMI topics that you should become familiar with, and we're going to talk about them: patient autonomy, informed consent, patient confidentiality, conflict of interest, the principle of justice. And I think we can talk also, and Francesca can add her advice on this, but in terms of how to approach each MMI prompt, you want to try as best you can to read each prompt at least twice. The first time you read it, you may be a little nervous, you may miss things, you may want to go back and read it again to ensure that you're getting all the details of that prompt. You want to make sure that you take your full allotted time to prepare your response. So even if you think after a minute, you know what you're going to say, go back and read the prompt again. Think about other things that you may want to speak about in your response, but take the full allotted time. I always recommend that when the individual assessing you comes on the screen, that you at that point introduce yourself, start off by introducing yourself and restating the prompt in your own words, right? And then if you can, ask some clarifying questions to gather additional information. Or in your response, you can also talk about additional things you may want to know and how that would change your response, change your assessment to the situation. Would you agree with this, Francesca?
Yeah, I do agree. And I think restating the prompt and saying, am I understanding this correctly? Also make sure is that you and the interviewer are getting off on the same foot. And when you do give your first answer, if you do understand it correctly, which you should, you should also allot time when you're thinking about it to leave room for follow-up questions, unless it's a really short time period. But if you have 6 to 8 minutes, you should obviously not be speaking for that full time. You have to leave room for follow-up questions, and you should treat that as still like very well assessing you, but also they more times than not are trying to get you nudging towards an answer if they're asking follow-up questions, and you kind of have to be in tune to that, which comes with practice.
Right. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. I think you have to be careful in reading the prompt. There may be things that are purposely put in there to kind of dissuade you from going one direction, and you have to be very careful not to necessarily follow that, to be tricked into thinking they want another response.
Mhm.
And they may press you also once you come to your decision. They may press you on that response and your decision, and you really need to defend it. They may add in also additional information and ask you if your decision would still remain the same. Okay, so how to best use the first 2 minutes. We talked about not taking notes. We talked about when you're thinking about developing your response, to think about the key actors in the scenario, how you can sort of put yourself in their shoes, demonstrating empathy for each actor. Think about the key perspectives and the conflict of interest or the problem that's being presented. Think about the ethical issues raised by the scenario. Think about the possible legal or policy issues raised. And then, of course, think about how you're going to come out and make a final stance on how you would approach that scenario.
I also think here, when you're reading the prompt and coming up and just starting to think about it, don't read between the lines at all. Do not assume anything at all. And I think that I kept making that mistake when I was practicing. So just, yeah, never assume anything. Always ask a follow-up question, and always think about every possibility and every single outcome in a sense, which would make more sense when you're looking at examples.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So I think it's helpful to have a general framework for approaching each scenario. Because sometimes, some scenarios are going to be just really complicated for you, or difficult to come to a decision. And I think if you have a basic framework, at least you know how you're going to organize your response and how you're going to begin to think about your justification for how you're going to act. This 5-step framework is one we call PPRDJ, which is identifying the problem, Then stating the different perspectives of the people involved in the scenario, as again, thinking from their point of view, why they might be acting in a certain way, what they might be thinking about. And then, of course, you may want to gather more information if necessary. And then responsibility. What does that mean? Assess your responsibility in the scenario, meaning what is your role? Are you a friend, advisor, student, colleague, peer, physician? What is your role? State your decision. Okay, and then describe how you would act. So then after you state your decision, you're going to provide your justification for your actions. As you describe and share that justification, always remember to respect individual privacy and demonstrate professionalism, be unbiased and non-judgmental, show teamwork, consider the impact on others, compassion, empathy, and your understanding of the ethical principles presented. We'll talk more about these: justice, patient self-autonomy, beneficence, and non-maleficence. And remember, you have to speak out loud what's going through your mind. And that is really the key to performing well in this type of scenario. Don't just assume that the interviewer is going to know what you're thinking about. You have to state it. Not just, I would talk to this person and explain to them, where would you talk to this person? Why would you take them to a certain location? Explain that you would try to respect their dignity by taking them to a private location so that they don't feel that they're being confronted, and that they feel more comfortable that you have their best interests in mind and can be open in explaining why they're acting in a certain way. But you have to speak out loud about every step of the process. Would you agree with that, Francesca?
Yeah, and I definitely agree. And I remember when I attended this, the person who was in my position said, think of it as steps. You guide the interviewer like to each step of your thinking, and you get to a higher level of thinking each time, but you really have to set the scene. And I think I also just want to add, the responsibility is oftentimes not stated in the prompt. And so that usually was my first clarifying question before I gave my responses. What is my role? Because they can give you a scenario, but it doesn't say you're this person's friend, or you're this person's advisor, or you're the professor. So I think that don't assume your responsibility either based on what you think it might be. And I think that sometimes they purposely leave out your responsibility, because I one time just assumed I was the doctor, and that was the first follow-up question, but we never said that you were the physician. So don't assume that. It's a very easy mistake to make.
Right. So you want to always try when you're, sharing your perspectives, to always remain non-judgmental and non-confrontational. Identify with the patient or the participant, discuss how you would approach them in a way that is private, allows them to speak openly while preserving confidentiality. Confidentiality is a very big uh, I guess, I'm trying to think of the word. It's a topic or aspect that they are looking to see that you can demonstrate and are aware of. Discuss how you would give the individuals involved the chance to explain their side of the story. And do not make assumptions or jump to conclusions, as Francesca said. If a decision needs to be made by the patient or participant, ensure that they have all information necessary to make their decision. That's the concept of informed consent, which is connected to the ethical principle of patient self-autonomy. It may be necessary for you to consult with other members of your team. Remember, medicine is a team-based activity. So you can talk about you know, if there are ethical issues involved, maybe, and you're in a hospital situation, maybe reaching out to the hospital ethics committee for advice, or reaching out to other colleagues who may have dealt with situations like this one. So the key is here to think out loud, express in words every step of your thought process. And I think that's the challenge, because a lot of times you are thinking things in your head, but you're not necessarily in the you know, you're not used to talking about what's going through your mind as you're thinking it to the interviewer. And you can discuss the possible courses of action, you know, explore many different options and just think out loud and how you would approach each one. You could do something without question and discuss the pros and cons of that. You can refuse to do anything and discuss the pros and cons of that. And you can choose a middle ground and you know, explore why each option is good or bad. Consider individual consequences as well as the impact to society at large, which also goes to the ethical principle of justice and equity. Consider ethical concerns, consider potential legal consequences. You don't have to be an expert in the law, but just be educated enough, knowledgeable enough to know that there may be legal consequences or legal implications to your actions. It's also helpful if you can draw upon examples from your personal life that relate to the scenario at hand.
I also think here, when you're considering the ethical and legal consequences and you're not sure what to say, or just how to approach that, something that I would do if I was unsure would say, if I'm working in a hospital, I would consult the ethics committee in the hospital, or the legal board. And I think that was always received well, because it also it shows that you're knowledgeable about hospital systems, and that doctors do have those, the healthcare team has those resources to use, and you would utilize them. So I think even if you don't know, you could appeal it to someone who does, and it just looks good on you as well.
Right, right. And it also shows a certain sense of humility, right? You don't know everything, but you're willing to go out and take advantage of the resources that are available to you to discuss your concerns and to get their advice. Right, so we'll talk a little bit more about ethical principles, but you do have to be familiar with the pillars of medical ethics, and you do have to be able to identify the ethical principles that are presented by each scenario. We talked about legal principles, you know, understanding how the law may impact your ability to act, which obviously will vary depending on the state you interview in as well. You know, most students will be interviewing in New York. They might be interviewing in other states that have MMIs, but you want to become, you know, somewhat familiar with the laws of those states and the, you know, healthcare policy and the issues presented in that regard. So just, I'd like to talk a little bit, review the principles of medical ethics. I would take the time to educate yourself on these principles so you really understand them and understand how they apply to different scenarios and be able to identify the issues presented. The first is patient autonomy. The second pillar of medical ethics is beneficence. Third pillar of medical ethics is non-maleficence. And then the fourth is justice. Patient autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So the first ethical pillar, patient autonomy. What does that mean? It means that the patient has the right to make a decision regarding their treatment, provided that the patient has the capacity to make a decision. and the patient is provided with the necessary information to make that decision. Okay, so those things are critical to determining whether the patient has the right to make a decision regarding their treatment. You have to determine, number one, does the patient have capacity? Number two, has the patient been given the necessary information to make that decision? So you're going to need to assess whether the patient has the physical and mental capacity to make a voluntary and informed decision regarding their medical treatment. What does that mean? It means you have to consider or ask or find out more information to learn if the patient has autonomy of thought, intention, and action when making decisions regarding healthcare procedures. Right? So the decision-making process must be free of coercion or coaching. In order for a patient to make a fully informed decision, they must understand all risks and benefits of the procedure and the likelihood of success.
I would also add there that I think it's also important to assess why the patient wants a certain treatment, and I think that becomes most relevant when you have the common question of a minor, or not a minor, but a teenager asking for birth control or something like that. I think the first thing to assume is that it's for sex or for that whatever reason, but it could be for other reasons. So I think just also assessing why they want a treatment and making sure they understand, and you as the doctor knowing that that is the correct treatment too, is another layer of it.
Okay, I mean, you mean, Francesca, in terms of, maybe they're asking for a friend, or maybe they're asking because they think it's something that other people are doing? Well,
I just,
I'm
no, just in terms of mostly just that question, because I feel like the question's always, oh, a 14-year-old is asking you for birth control, but doesn't want
right.
to tell her parents or something like that. How would you go about it? And you are not supposed to assume that it's for like a certain reason, because if it's for one reason, then it necessitates a whole other conversation. But if it's for another reason, then you go a different conversation, and you don't want to assume one over the other.
Got it. Okay. All right. So beneficence is basically the ethical principle that means doctors are ethically bound to do good for the patient, to do what's in the best interest for the patient. Okay. And that means physicians are responsible for always keeping up to date on their necessary skills and knowledge, continually updating training, making sure they consider the individual circumstances of all patients, striving for net benefit, and really thinking about not simply what is medically good for the patient, but also what's acceptable to the human being you are treating. And I think that's part of the practice of beneficence. And also beneficence involves ranking the available options for the patient from best to worst and taking into consideration the following aspects. Will this option resolve the patient's medical problem? Is it proportionate to the scale of the problem? Is it compatible with this patient's individual circumstances? Is the option and its outcomes in line with the patient's expectations of treatment? Remember that what is good for one patient may not be good for another. And that's the concept of patient-centered care, which is also part of your duty as a physician with regard to beneficence. So this third pillar of medical ethics is kind of the converse of beneficence, and that's non-maleficence, meaning you have a duty to not harm a patient. And that not harm a patient also means that, sometimes you harm a patient more by not responding at all. So, if you see a patient collapse in a corridor, you have a duty to provide or seek medical attention to prevent injury. It also means that if you're performing a procedure, you have to do it in a way that does the least amount of harm to a patient. You have to consider the medical outcomes, and the benefits to the patient must outweigh the risks. Similarly, a doctor cannot force a patient to follow their advice, which is the concept of patient self-autonomy. But equally, a doctor can refuse to provide treatment that they will believe will do more harm than good to the patient. Okay? So that's, if you feel, a patient could come in and be certain they want a particular treatment, but if you know it's not right for them because it'll cause more harm than good, you also are ethically bound not to perform it if you know that it will cause harm to the patient. Fourth pillar of medical ethics, justice, has different meanings. It requires that the burdens and benefits of new or experimental treatments must be distributed equally among all groups in society. So the idea of equity. It also refers to the fact that a physician must treat all patients equally and equitably. And you have to consider areas when, all of these areas when evaluating justice. The idea of fair distribution of resources. If you have one ventilator and two people who are struggling to breathe, who gets the ventilator? Or one kidney and both immediately need a new kidney. Who do you give the kidney to? And, how do you approach the situation? Justice also refers to competing needs, the duty to the minor patient and the duty to respect the guardian and parent. It also refers to rights and obligations. The right, doctors have the right not to accept health insurance, but on the other hand, justice requires that we treat all patients equally. So there may also be just the concept of justice raised by potential conflicts with established legislation. So I don't know if you want to add anything here, Francesca.
I think you covered everything. This is very important. And also just when it comes to distributing resources, I would be a little familiar about like what available resources are on, because I got a question once about that and I hadn't known that there are certain things that and rules that determine who gets what, and I didn't reference it. And so just being kind of familiar with those kinds of things can be really helpful if it does come up.
You mean specific protocols that are in place for determining who gets a particular organ? Is
Yes.
that what you're talking about? Yeah, yeah. And then, of course, there are legal considerations that impact each one of these principles, right? For autonomy, it's the concept of consent. Is the patient competent to make a decision? Are they of legal age and sound mind, or are they below the legal age but judged to be emotionally and intellectually competent to make their own decision? The idea of patient confidentiality and privacy, the concept of, the legislation required by HIPAA regarding access to records and privacy, right? However, even those, confidentiality requirements can be undone when a doctor has a greater legal duty to the public if they have knowledge of foreseeable harm to others or themselves. If the patient comes in and says, they're going to kill themselves or they're going to kill someone else, a friend, someone in their family, they do have an obligation to alert those individuals or proper resources to alert those individuals of the fact that there may be foreseeable harm to those individuals, even though the patient is talking to the physician in the privacy of their own, office. If there's foreseeable harm to others, they do have a duty to respect the larger safety of the public. Then there's, of course, medical negligence laws and laws that require physicians to protect the public from foreseeable harm that a patient may inflict on others. And that also goes with do no harm to the concept of non-maleficence. And then relating to justice, we know there are anti-discrimination laws. So even though there's a lot of information to process and different views of your stakeholders and different ways that you can approach a situation that may be very complicated and difficult, you have to come to a final stance. Even with complex issues where you see all sides, you need to choose a side and articulate it. So present your final decision on which approach you would choose. It can be a conditional, if this and this is the situation, then I would come out this way. But you have to come to a final stance. Any words on that, Francesca? Coming to a final stance?
Yeah, I think you should always end with a final stance, but it honestly always was conditional for me. If this, and that, then I would proceed this way. And they can always, they can always go against the condition you put on it, and then you can give an alternative response, which often happens. But yeah, I think you need to, and it needs to tie all together and be articulated and be grounded in logic and reason. And I would avoid using strong language too. Just, I like to think of it as giving not a hard answer, but a soft answer, because it can always change depending on the scenario. And you have to show that you know that you only have such a handful of information.
Right. So in your final stance considerations, you are able to stand your ground when challenged. But obviously, if the information changes, that might change your final stance. You can also think about ways maybe to prevent this situation from happening again. Maybe there's certain protocols you would put into place or policy changes you would advocate for so this wouldn't happen again. You would think about resources you would use, new policies to be implemented. So a lot to think about. Okay, let's apply what we just covered to respond to some potential MMI prompts, okay? Here is the first situation. Imagine that you are a family physician and you are seeing a 15-year-old girl for menstrual cramps. Her mother has accompanied her to this visit. When you examine the patient privately without her mother present, she tells you that she is sexually active. She also begs you not to tell her mother because of her family's strong values against teen sex. And you have to discuss your next steps. So again, you're going to take your full 2 minutes to organize your response. You're going to name the problem and identify the biggest risk that is seen or revealed by the scenario. After introducing yourself and restating the scenario to ensure you understand it, you won. So following that same organization, PPR, DJ, name the problem. In this case, the problem lies with the competing interests of the mother and the daughter. As the hypothetical doctor, you have an obligation to the daughter as the patient. But on the other hand, in many circumstances, we legally deem a 15-year-old as minors who lack the maturity needed to make important health decisions. So here you're going to state the different perspectives. Look at the different people involved in the scenario. Describe their various viewpoints or what could be their various viewpoints and gather more information if necessary, right? You could acknowledge that different states have different laws about healthcare policy for minors, especially when it involves parental consent or disclosure. But if you're operating outside these restrictions, your first priority always lies with the patient. You should take the time to recognize the mother's interest in her daughter's health and well-being, but also acknowledge your duty to the minor patient and the daughter's request for patient confidentiality. After accommodating the mother's perspective, explain how a patient's request for confidentiality would outweigh any parental concerns, especially since, as presented, the issue does not appear life-threatening. Identify your responsibility in this scenario. What is your role? Here you are the physician. It tells you that you're the physician. So you're going to have to assess your responsibilities from that perspective. As the doctor, you have an obligation to the daughter as your patient. Despite the fact that as a society, 15-year-olds are still minors in many cases who lack the maturity needed to make important health decisions. As a medical provider, your priority must be to your patient and to respect their desire for confidentiality, as long as there is no reason to think that harm would come to someone else. You want to state your decision and describe how you would act. So it's not enough to talk about the hypothetical interest. Now you must take action. In this scenario, you are the physician. Your first duty is for the patient's health and well-being. If the patient understands the consequences of their actions and does not and will not cause harm to others, then you are obligated to keep all information the patient shares with you confidential. In talking about your justification for your action, you can talk about the principle of beneficence, right? Doing good for your patient, having the duty to the patient as your first responsibility. If you're familiar with the laws of New York State and the interview happens to be in a New York State school, you would know that minors do have the same rights as adults to access reproductive health services, including abortion and birth control, without parental consent, if they can give informed consent, right? So informed consent means understanding the risks, benefits, and alternatives of the procedure or treatment, including the option not to have it, right? Providers are encouraged and should encourage minors to talk with a supportive adult, but no one else's permission is required when it comes to reproductive health. And also in New York State, healthcare providers generally cannot share medical records or information about appointments or procedures without the minor's permission. Of course, there are exceptions to that rule if there is harm or foreseeable harm to the patient or to someone else. And of course, you want to discuss your responsibility to remain unbiased and non-judgmental. You would want to inform your patient that they are in a safe place and that the information they share with you will remain confidential, okay? And I think here, it's also important to see what the patient's not asking. The patient's not coming to ask for birth control. The patient's not coming, about a concern relating to be sexually active, but they are coming for treatment of menstrual cramps, and they also mention that they're sexually active and ask you not to tell their parents. However, as a physician, I think it's important in carrying out your duty of beneficence or doing good for your patient and in explaining your justification for how you would go about acting, that you would take this time as a moment to educate your patient and to ensure she understands the consequences of her actions. So I think it's important that you acknowledge that this is an educational moment to have a conversation, not only with the mother about, the results of your exam regarding her menstrual cramps, but also to speak to the patient and ensure that they understand, you know, what's involved in being sexually active, and does that patient, that 15-year-old, understand the risks and responsibilities of being sexually active? You can ask, does she have one or more than one sexual partner? You can ask and educate your patient about the risks of STDs and birth control. You can ask what type of birth control she's using. You can also ask and educate your patient on the consequences of pregnancy, and has she thought about what steps she would take if she became pregnant, right? So you can take this as really a teachable moment, and use this to ensure that your patient really fully understands the risks and responsibilities of being sexually active. And then, of course, later in conversations with the mother, you can obviously discuss the daughter's menstrual cramps and the prescribed treatment for the condition. You could also possibly mention, ask the mother if she's had a discussion with her daughter about sex, and maybe encourage the mother to have that conversation with the daughter and explain that, at this time, patients during their teenage years may, want to have that conversation but are afraid to broach it, or maybe would want to know, or at least acknowledge that, they're willing to have that conversation with the parent. Now, the parent may refuse based on their religion or cultural background, but at least you can mention the value of possibly having that conversation. And then you may have personal experiences, right? That relate to this scenario. And you can draw on those in terms of, cultural or parental opposition to certain actions. It doesn't have to specifically relate to being sexually active. It can relate to other things and other, difficulties that you can relate to, or that you have friends who've had shared with you their difficulties with speaking to their parents about certain things in their lives because of cultural or religious restrictions on them. And then, of course, they can come back, and as Francesca said, they can ask different questions at the end. So they may come back with possible variable that they might introduce to the situation, and see if your position would change based on these new factors, right? For example, if your exam and tests indicate that the daughter had an STD or other serious health issue, you might be justified or even required to inform the mother. At the very least, the information would affect the way you engage and educate the daughter on the topic. And your diagnosis may also require that the daughter inform her sexual partner or partners about that STD or other health condition. Another hypothetical twist would be if the mother took strong offense to asking about whether she has spoken to her daughter about sex. Maybe she misinterpreted your counsel as accusatory, and you would need to take extra measures to placate her and reestablish her trust and rapport. But they could, add in different variables. Okay, before I go on to this next scenario, is there anything you want to add?
Just be flexible. I got some really hard follow-up questions to different scenarios. And so I think that even when you practice, you really just have to also treat it as a conversation and be flexible. And you can't freeze up if you get a follow-up question where where you're not sure at least. And you can always say, could I just have a few seconds to think about it?
Right. I mean, I think overall, though, Francesca, I mean, you may have had some tough MMIs, but I think at the end of the day, I think they want to try to help you succeed.
They do. They do. I just remember I had this scenario and the question was, what if the sexual partner was 17 or 18. And I know in New York, the legal age of consent is 17 years old. And if you go, there's certain laws around that. And I knew that, but I think that if I wasn't really reading about that, I would have froze up. So just always be prepared. But they do try to help you. But sometimes they don't want to trip you up, but they just want to see how you flexibly respond to things and assessing, how
Sure.
to respond.
Okay, here's a different kind of scenario completely. You see a man with his children. They are all riding bicycles, but none of them are wearing helmets. Would you approach this man about the issue? Why or why not? Again, we want to follow the same organization, PPR DJ. Okay, so first, name the problem and the biggest risks. And this is after, of course, you come in and introduce yourself, and because typically every scenario you have a different interviewer, and you want to again restate the prompt in your own words to ensure that you do understand it correctly. But you want to name the problem and the biggest risk. So here, the key issue is obviously your desire to prevent the bike riders from any harm as a result of not wearing bike helmets. And that should, be your guide, right? That idea of do good for others, prevent harm. What are the consequences if you do not intervene? What are the consequences if you do intervene? What are the legal considerations here? And then, of course, you want to state the perspectives of the people involved in the scenario. Think of that, how they might be thinking about this, describe their various viewpoints, and gather more information if necessary. Consider why an actor might be acting in a certain way. Why is the current situation the way it is? Who else is involved and how are they affected? I'd want to know if the man and his children are able to be approached without causing harm. Are they riding their bikes when I see them? Is this person someone I know? And would they be open to receiving advice, or would they be likely react negatively to uninvited suggestions? I'd want to know if the state I am in has a helmet law. I would want to know if they are riding on a main road or on a quiet park path or quiet neighborhood road. And this might also impact my approach to this scenario. Then, of course, you have to assess your role here. What is your role? Here, you are a bystander, just a concerned member of your community. But, you do have a duty to act to avoid harm to the children, even as a bystander. If they are riding, and then it might not be advisable or practicable to approach them to express your concern about not wearing helmets, as it may cause the riders to lose their focus and fall. If they have stopped at a safe spot where you can approach them, then maybe you want to say hello and express your concern for their safety, especially the children's safety, and suggest that they consider wearing bike helmets. If there is a state law requiring bike helmets, and you can safely approach this man and his children, you would introduce yourself as a concerned member of the community and remind them of the legal requirement to wear a helmet when riding their bike. Of course, your response might vary depending on whether you know this person, if you think they might be open to receiving the suggestion, right? So if this is a person I know and are open to taking my advice, and if they're in a place where I could safely approach them, then maybe you would tell them that you're concerned for their safety and know that they would be much better protected from possible injury if they wore bike helmets. If this is a person you do not know, then you would have to really assess whether or not you can approach this person. So you would consider whether you would cause greater harm by approaching them or by not approaching them, right? And this goes to the concept of beneficence and non-maleficence. Consider whether the bike riders are in danger and the ages of the children. Are these little children, like 7 years old, 5 years old? Are these children that are more, 12 and 13? Also consider whether they're riding on a major road with a lot of vehicular traffic, or if they're riding in a park or quiet neighborhood street where there's very little traffic. And then, of course, you can draw upon your own personal experiences in speaking about your justification. Maybe you know someone who's fallen off a bike and sustained injuries to their head due to not wearing a helmet. You can talk about that. Do you know someone who avoided a head injury because they were wearing a helmet? Maybe you've done research on traumatic brain injuries or have experience with someone who sustained a concussion. Perhaps you have experience riding your bike on a busy city avenue and were knocked off your bike, or perhaps you know someone who was knocked off their bike. And you can, talk about these personal experiences and how they may also relate to what you would do in this scenario. Okay. Then of course, when you're talking about your response, you do want to try to show empathy also for the bike riders. Consider ways to help them without causing further harm, right? Acknowledge that while you have a duty to help those in need, you also have to understand that there are limits to the situations where you can safely intervene, and that the other people must be open to receiving your assistance. If you are concerned for their immediate safety, because you see that they're riding without bike helmets, these are little kids, there's a lot of vehicular traffic with trucks, and you're unable to approach them, you can talk about possibly calling 911 and asking for the assistance of public safety. Okay? But you do have to take a final stance. It can be conditional, as we talked about. In the end, you do have a duty to try to prevent harm to others in the community through raising awareness of potential dangers of certain actions or inactions. And this is really what is at stake in this scenario. You can, of course, choose to intervene if able to do so, and encourage them to wear bike helmets if it's feasible without causing further harm. All right. Anything you want to add there, Francesca?
Just practice, practice, practice. That's all. The scenarios will always change. So it's more about, don't focus too much on a scenario, but rather how you approach a scenario.
Right, and here's more scenarios, right? So I'm just going to read a couple things you might get. Maybe a relatively healthy patient sees you and has a slight limp. They immediately ask for a letter to authorize them to apply for a handicap car sticker. How do you proceed, right? Again, it could be a role play situation with an actor, or it could just be a scenario in which you would respond to the interviewer. But again, you want to name the problem, state the different perspectives, assess your responsibility, state your decision, and then share the justification for your actions, including how you would go about determining whether or not you would oblige with their request for a letter to authorize them to apply for a handicap car sticker. Then there are role-playing scenarios. Enter the examination room and speak to the patient about their drug addiction, right? This is designed to be vague. And again, you shouldn't assume anything. But it is really focusing on your ability to speak one-on-one with the patient about their addiction to legal substances. Because the question's purposely vague, you're going to need to ask more questions for clarification, right? Is this a patient that has been a longtime patient of yours? Is this someone that you are just seeing now for the first time? you'd want to know more about what their drug addiction is, what the severity of the situation is. But it requires that you engage with an actor who's playing the role of the patient. Did you have any role playing, Francesca?
I had one, and the way that it worked was there was it was on the screen, you're about to enter an examination room and you're about to talk with this person, and it explained what I was supposed to do and what my role is. And once it switched to the woman, it was right into it. It was not, hi, how are you, or anything. You were right into it. And it's very believable. They really do act out very well. And it was my only one, but I think, yeah, you have to be on it for those.
Okay, that's very good advice. Just other possible scenarios and questions, maybe enter a room and respond to a picture or photograph. And again, it's designed to be perfectly vague so that, you're going to see they're assessing bias, they're assessing, whether you're able to see different things in that photograph and really reflect on the different perspectives that that photograph raises. You may need to ask questions for clarification, right? And these are all possibilities. Tell a patient they have less than 3 months to live. Again, this could be an actual role play and, with an actor. And although you're not yet a doctor, they are assessing whether or not you have the qualities necessary to one day be a doctor. Are you someone who can, be honest with the patient while also showing empathy and support for that patient as well as concern for their privacy? Sometimes there are even writing elements in the MMI, right? I've had students get assignments like, they have one of their stations, they're asked to write an essay on how they would go about reducing vaping among teens at the national level, right? So this is, they're not really testing your grammar or your spelling, but they want to see, can you organize your thoughts in a way that allows you to see how you would approach this kind of problem. And then there's the hybrid MMIs, and I'm sure Francesca has had those too, where they include both ethical scenarios as well as traditional interview questions, such as, why do you want to be a physician, or why do you want to attend our medical school? So you have to be able and prepared to answer both kinds of questions. Did Student Doctor Network help you with any of those?
No,
Whether it was hybrid or not?
I didn't know that. So I had one MMI for a school that was hybrid, and I did not know until it happened. The Student Doctor Network is really only good for the traditional interview. For MMIs, and you're not supposed to, after an MMI, you're not supposed to share the questions. So it makes sense that you're not going to find it online nor the format. So the school, right before it got started, said that it would be hybrid. A different school didn't say it, and it was hybrid. So you always have to have those two questions ready, especially why our medical school, because it is school specific.
Right, of course. So in terms of preparation for the MMI, we talked about developing a framework or structure for how to respond to the scenarios. The one we talked today, problem perspective, responsibility, decision, justification, is one that's pretty popular, but if it doesn't work for you, you can come up with your own template. Definitely review the pillars of medical ethics and be able to apply these ethical principles to different scenarios. Review current issues in medicine and healthcare, as Francesca said. Review the current state laws on abortion, legal age, assisted suicide, or right to die, legislation, DNR orders, and HIPAA. Be familiar with discussing various perspectives or possible outcomes in a conditional format. Review sample MMI scenarios online. Practice your timing and responses with friends, colleagues, and advisors. Here are some resources. Francesca referred to the Savvy Pre-Med. They do have an interview generator, which is very helpful. There's BMO sample questions with answers. The University of Washington Ethics and Medicine resource is a good one. And of course, I always recommend the MMI book by Dr. Desai. So yeah, you're going to have to manage your stress, maintain your composure. Remember, your ability to master a new situation in a time-sensitive manner is really what's being assessed here. And also remember that each scenario has a different interviewer. So if you really feel like you performed poorly in one, you're just going to have to clear that out of your head and then recompose yourself and enter the next scenario with a whole new, attitude of another opportunity to do well. Would you agree with that, Francesca?
Yeah, and you don't have a break, so they're rapid, so you have to shape up quickly and you really can't get discouraged. And yeah, you will always it's really rare that you'll have less than 6. It's minimum 6, and like that school said, they only need 6 to attest to your character, so 1 is not the end of the world. It's okay. And sometimes you did better than you think.
So, like, how did you handle thank you notes for this kind of interview?
Usually it was the school would say that you can send it to them, and I always grouped them because I never really spent too much time with an interviewer and I to like make a connection and establish rapport as I would in the traditional, and at the same time you don't remember their name most times because it's going so fast that it's hard to get them all down.
So
And then
you would just send a thank you note to the person who organized the interview or the admissions committee?
the admissions office, they usually give you the email of the admissions office, and also sometimes, especially if they use a platform, you don't have their names.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. Francesca has a little bit of a time commitment. She has to leave in about 5 minutes or less. So if there are burning questions for her, please unmute and ask. Are there anything in the chat that you can see, Francesca, that
Yes, so Anna asked, would I introduce myself beyond just saying hello and your name? That it would be my introduction. Hi, my name is Francesca, and thank you for interviewing me today. And then they would say, "Are you ready to start?" And I would say yes. That was almost always across schools, across interviewers, the beginning first 10 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, really, thank you so much. Is there anything else in the chat that I'm missing?
No, I'm just gonna, someone asked for my email, so I would drop my email for everyone for follow-up questions if they come up later in the cycle or when you guys apply.
Thank you so much, Francesca. I am just gonna share the PP 1003 reflection statement. I know sometimes students always ask me that for that they don't have the link. Let me just share that with you now. So you can submit that reflection right away. Don't wait. And you can get credit for attending today's workshop. Okay. So Benjamin says, I've watched some videos explaining and showing examples of MMI interviews, and I noticed they asked to act out the majority of the time. Wait, Benjamin, can you unmute and just explain what you're asking here?
Yeah, so it was answered in the chat, but I was just basically saying I've watched a lot of MMI interviews, and in those interviews, like the videos of them, most of them were acted out scenarios where the interviewee would it would immediately start with an acting out scenario and that's it. So I wanted to know if that was representative of like all of the MMI interviews, or if it's really a balance, like maybe 50-50 or 60-40 split instead of a biased one like I've had, a biased view like I've seen. Yeah.
And what would you say, Francesca? Split?
No, I had one act out scenario out of all of my interviews, out of all my scenarios, so it's not representative for me, but at the same time, you should always assume that you could get anything at any sort of time.
Great. Well, I can't thank you enough, Francesca. This has been terrific. Thank you so much for helping out. Very much
course.
appreciated. Thank you for coming today, everyone. And I did post the link to the reflection form, and Francesca did share her email, which was very kind of her. Don't bombard her with emails, but if you do have a genuine question that you want to ask, I'm sure she'd be happy to answer.
Of
Um,
course.
Have a good day, everyone. And this seminar will be added to our YouTube channel under the PAP 1003 seminar playlist. Okay? Thank
Thanks.
you. Have a good day, everyone.